Good day. Welcome to Conversations with Great Authors. I'm John Harrison, co-editor with Kim Nagy of Dead in Good Company, a celebration of Mount Auburn Cemetery. Today we're here with Upton Bell, author of Present at the Creation, and he's going to tell us about his storied career in football, in broadcasting on radio and TV, on interviewing, and about his famous mother and father, Francis Upton, the Broadway star, and Bert Bell, the commissioner of football and owner of the Philadelphia Eagles. Upton, welcome to Conversations of Great Authors.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here, not in dead company, but in good company. I'm still alive right here. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
It is. So you've got 50,000 questions, so let's start. Whatever you want.
Well, let's start with your father, of course, with Bert Bell, owner of the Philadelphia Eagles and the commissioner of football and the father of the NFL as we know it today. Let's start with that.
Well, you know, it's really interesting. A lot of people don't know that Bert Bell actually was one of the best high school athletes in Philadelphia. And in fact, many people thought he was a baseball prospect, big league prospect, more than a football prospect. He eventually went to, well, he went 2 or 3 prep schools, always just barely getting out the door to run the other one. But he ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania. And the interesting thing was the Philadelphia, I think it wasn't called the Inquirer then, had a quote, front page quote, headline. When John C. Bell, his father, who was the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, second in command on the Walter Camp Rules Committee, a trustee of Pennsylvania, was asked, where is young Bert Bell going? Headline, Bert Bell will go to Penn or he will go to hell. That was the headline. It is still around today. So he ended up going to Penn and becoming their quarterback, who eventually threw the first pass in Rose Bowl history in 1917, when the Ivy League and Penn and Harvard and teams like that were the powers in America. And actually his story of throwing that first forward pass against Oregon, 100 years later, they came back to honor him, and I was down there for that. But he was a quarterback there. He was one of the leading punters and drop kickers at the time. Drop kicking was, as we saw when Doug Flutie attempted to do it here with the Patriots, was a big thing. He could score from any angle. But the other thing is about his life that a lot of people don't know is that in his junior year, he was elected captain. They played on Thanksgiving Day against Cornell, which was a traditional game at that time. Right after the game was over, he and most of the football team and many of the athletes at Penn walked down to the depot and registered for the draft. They joined the Army. They fought across Europe. One of his best friends, who people might not remember, but I'll refresh their memory, in that group was John B. Kelly. Grace Kelly, the famous actress, Princess of Monaco's father. They were lifelong friends. They fought their way across Europe. In the end, Bert Bell was honored by General Pershing for valor in the field. Came back to Penn, finished his senior year, and then went on to coach throughout the Ivy League at Penn and Temple and places like that. So he had a career all before that had nothing to do. In fact, there was a story written by Kevin Paul DuPont in the Boston papers about 3 or 4 years ago. His father was one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia, owned hotels, the Ritz-Carlton, still has a mansion, which I wish I had, that's on the National Historic Register in Rittenhouse Square. But one time he got in a fight with one of the players from Dartmouth, and they were playing then the next year. And he said, if we lose the game, he owned a Studs Bearcat, which was the car. He said, if we lose that damn game, he said, I will leave the keys in the car and the car's yours. They lost the game. The guy went to the parking lot. Of course, today you couldn't get away with it, and drove the car away. There are more stories about him before he became famous as the founder of the Eagles, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the first person in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. That he was one of the best golfers, amateur golfers in America. So one time, He was drinking out at a country club outside of Philadelphia, and this guy said, "You know what? So damn good." He said, "I'm going to bet you." I think it was like $5,000. Then, when $5,000, he said, "I can beat you." And my father said to him, "I'll tell you what. I'm going to blindfold myself and play you the last 9 holes and put the $5,000 up in cash." He played the last 9 holes blindfolded and won the bet. That was, think about that. I mean,
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
yeah,
Sure,
and he wasn't pulling
yeah,
it down and
yeah.
cheating or anything else. He was just one of those great, fabulous characters that in the end, he coached with John Heisman, the Heisman Trophy. But the turning point, and we're going to get into some of the things about my mother a little bit later on. The turning point was he was a playboy up to the age of 39. He knew everybody. He knew Al Capone. In those days, gangsters and people from all walks of life all kind of hung together. They went to Saratoga Racetrack in New York. They all knew each other. Unlike today, when
Yeah,
you
you
have
could
to
do that then.
Yeah, unlike today, when you can meet some idiot on Twitter, then you really had to know these people. So actually, he met my mother at a party, and she had become quite a star, which we'll get to later on in Broadway. She, at the time, was engaged to the famous financier's son, Bernard Baruch. Bernard Baruch was Franklin Roosevelt's chief financial man. She was Catholic, he was Jewish. In the end, it didn't work out. She broke off the engagement. I mean, she could have had a wonderful, very, very rich life instead of marrying some poor bum that's trying to keep his team going. They met at a party in New York. Axel Lindbergh was at the party, and he asked her, he said, I'd like to really go out with you, honey. And she said, "Nobody calls me honey," number one. And she said, number two, "I don't date drunks." So it shows up 6 months later. His father owned the Ritz-Carlton, but the Ritz-Carlton roof, in those days, in between plays, the different actresses and actors played the roof and all these famous hotels and made a lot of money. So she happened to end up playing the Ritz-Carlton roof in Philadelphia, and he was running it at that time. And he said, "Hey, honey, how about coming down to my place? I want to show you my some of the outfits I have." She said, I'm not interested in seeing any of the outfits you have for those other women you sleep with." So that was it. She said, again, he said, "I'd really like to go out." She said, "I don't go out with people who drink." So a year later, in Atlantic City, he calls her long distance. She was in Chicago doing a play with Ruth Etting, who we'll also get to later. And he said, "If you marry me, I promise I'll never drink another day in my life." And he said, "All my drunken friends are here to hear the story." And she said, "Okay, I'll give you a year." And from that day on, he never had a drink the rest of his life. He had an iron will. They got married secretly. Walter Winchell, who would be CNN today, announced a secret marriage. She came back to Philadelphia. They get married on the church steps. They walk down to bankruptcy court. He bought out the Philadelphia, Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, which was almost like a semi-pro team. And they're walking back to their hotel, and he sees the National Recovery hack, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said, "That's the name of the team." So that's how they got started. Their honeymoon, and there are pictures that I found today, their honeymoon was in Atlantic City. They rented a house, and the football team went with them.
Now, your mother was very influential in the direction your father went in football, wasn't she? I mean,
Yeah.
she.
Well, that's correct. In those days, the college football is what the NFL is today. People look down on pro football. You know, pro football, you have the Bears, and you had eventually the Redskins, and you had the Green Bay Packers. Some great teams for there, but people look down their nose at it. In fact, my father had originally gone to his father, who was so wealthy, was, again, the Attorney General and very influential, and said we wanted to borrow the money. He said, "I don't give any money to those amateurs pretending like they're pros." So he had no choice. She was the one, in the end, that if it wasn't for Francis Upton, if we look at the whole history, Francis Upton, Burt Bell later on inventing the pro football draft, there'd be no NFL. Because if she hadn't convinced him, she said, "Why are you wasting your time with college football. She said, "Have you seen Red Grange come in? You know, the Wheaton Iceman." He said, she said, "Have you seen the Bears play?" She was in New York time. Go to the Polo Grounds and you see the New York Giants. She said, "Why are you wasting those times on those rank amateurs?" So she finally took him to a pro game. Not that he didn't know about it, but she's the one that was the influence for him to leave college football and get in the pros. That's life.
Yeah, she's very prescient. That's
Yeah.
it's a wonderful story. Now, what about your career in football itself? How you started? I know you can tell us a little bit about the Boston Patriots being the manager in 70-72. What was that like?
Well, before I get to that, let me get to the more bizarre stories.
Oh, okay, sure.
Is
Bizarre is good.
actually when I was born, 1937, my first place to live was in the hotel that his father owned, the Ritz-Carlton on Broad Street, which is now a pizza parlor. And they there, I mean, that was amazing. All the amazing acts from around the country played there. Bob Hope would come there, Danny Thomas, Cesar Romero, I mean, you named it. Well, where are you going to take 33 football players? And what are you going to do with your kids? So I ended up living in a hotel, which I loved. I mean, to run run the elevators, run wild, held everything. And so we lived in a hotel, and then we lived for a while in his father's mansion, and then finally moved from place to place to place and rented different places. But you had to, accommodate a place big enough for 33 football players. And there were many places I believe that they were thrown out of, because if you moved out to the main line and moved, next to somebody that's very, very rich and a beautiful house, and you have these players running out at all hours of the night and everything else like that, it was a completely different story.
Like the rock stars of later years in
hotels.
Yeah,
I mean, it was an amazing existence. All I can remember was, and when you're a child, I was never unhappy. I thought, geez, this next adventure, we're leaving this house and we're going to the next house. And it wasn't because we had chosen it. Somebody said, you got to get the hell out of here. I don't want these players in here in this neighborhood. So we moved from place to place to place. And finally, he had the team to live, the 30s. And part of that also was understanding what it was like to live in a communal experience. That set my life on a certain way, that you can't be selfish. You have to have an attitude of being able to share. You have to be able to live in a certain way. Remember, my mother, who had gone from a very middle-class family in New York to voted one of the most beautiful women in America, she basically, she stopped working. Today, she would still be working. She was only in her 20s when she essentially retired. But I often thought, what does she think? So I'm going from hanging out with Lindbergh and all these other people, and now I'm hanging out with Bert Bell, 33 football players. So it was like a I Love Lucy comedy. It was like a comedy you would see today. Family people. You never knew what was going to happen.
But obviously they loved each other.
Well, they did, and most people would say, Jesus, what type of life was that? That's why I think I can accept and face anything good or bad in life, because you had to be able to adjust. And, I was a boy. I was 7 years old. So all of that type of thing kind of set it in motion. And then I went to my first a training camp outside of the Eagles in 1946, Chicago Bears. They were the monsters of the Midway. They were the Patriots of today. And remember, this is before giant communications. Most of your games, some of them were televised until my father put in a national package. But you get 70, 80, 100,000 people for a game. I mean, this was a different world. But that kind of, I kind of started to study players. What did they do? How did they do it? Why this formation? Seeing the league as football began to develop. Clark Shaughnessy was the first person to develop what you see today. When you see Julian Edelman, if you'd seen him then, he would have been part of a backfield that had a fullback, a left halfback, and a right halfback. One of the backs were the receivers. there were no flankers. But Clark Shaughnessy, I watched him on a blackboard one day as a kid say, the way he described, we're going to break off one running back and put him out there as a flanker and see if they cover him. So I saw all of those beginnings and began to understand what made the game, and then I kind of said, this is something I think I want to do. So that's where it started there, and then progressed through the Baltimore Colts, which is one of the great experiences of my life, and being in Baltimore in the 60s, seeing a world with the great John Unitas and Gino Marchetti and Alan Amici, all these people who had returned from the war and knew what it was like to see death. Football and injuries wasn't anything to them. So going through that and then eventually ending up, as you said, with the Patriots, which was the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah. The good was I was the youngest general manager in history. Yeah. The bad was there were 33 owners. The ugly was it got to be a pretty bad situation when I came here. When I picked up, the day I was announced as general manager, I picked up the paper and said, Upton Bell comes to the BS Patriots. And I'm going, I can't believe this. And eventually I said to them, look, you don't want BS there, and then you don't want BS standing for Billy Sullivan. And I convinced the owners to change the name, which it is today, to the New England Patriots. But it was a wild ride. There were some great things that happened here. I brought in a lot of people that eventually ended up being general managers. Jim Plunkett came to us, who belongs in the Hall of Fame. But you could see it was building it. Yes, people only know it from 2000 to 2019, Tom Brady, right. The whole thing. But they don't know that other part, the struggles, the bizarreness, the craziness, the toilets not flushing, the stadium not working.
Yeah. They want to forget that.
The largest traffic jam in history. I just wrote a thing for a new book on pro football. I call it The Night the Carburetors Died, where every car that tried to get into the opening night, 1971 in August, to see the Giants play the Patriots in an exhibition game, and we barely got the goalposts in time for the game. So that's life. It's bizarre.
Now, one of the most moving, interesting stories in your book is about a trip south that you made. And there's a cultural aspect to this in addition to the football aspect. Tell us about that.
Well, it remains seared in my memory. I call the chapter. And I hope people get this book because it's just not a football book.
Exactly.
It's a book about.
No, it's really right. It's about the culture of the country
America.
at that time. Yeah. It's about our country,
and I had a chance to see America and still do. But in the 60s, in those days, unlike today where everything was computerized, I was a young kid. I was 24 years old, and they had put me in the scouting department, and they said, "Here's how you learn. Here are 50 brochures. We'll rented you a car. You'll leave Baltimore in January, and please don't come back till June." I'm going like, what, are you kidding me? What the hell is this? So there I was, and you know, you're somewhat scared. I mean, I've done a lot of driving, but in those days, unlike today where people drive and they fly everywhere, I had, other than being on a train with my father going to the West Coast in the 40s and seeing even Native Americans would dance on, if you stopped in Albuquerque on your way to the coast, which we did in 46, when you stopped there, Native Americans would get up and do their dances on the train itself. I mean, it was like the Wild West, which people would have, hard understanding. But anyway, that chapter on the South, and I'm going to do more of it at some time. My first stop, I went Baltimore, through Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley. And remember, all this trip then, which again, I'm going to do a second book on, I hope, there were no superhighways. You went through every little nook and cranny and every little town. You got to know America. Shenandoah Valley over into Georgia and then into Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. And then you work your way out west through New Mexico, Arizona. Then I drove all the way to the Oregon coast and back again. Every college, every brochure. And it's funny because every time I would walk in, again, I looked like I was 16 years old, and I walk in and say, Coach, I'm Upton Bell from the Baltimore Colts, and I'm here to take a look at your prospects. And he'd say, I thought you're the PR guy that worked here. I said, no, I'm really a scout. But what happened was, and what is seared in my memory forever and applies to today, is I had learned early on, particularly in Baltimore, because we did have African American players, even though they didn't come in till 1946, my father's first year, when he insisted we have to, the color line, this was before Jackie Robinson. And many of the things I learned, I will say to this audience today and around the country that, in my opinion, the African American is still not got the equal treatment that everybody else does. I saw it up close and personal. Part of my job was to go into every one of the African American schools. Now, in those days, you had to go to Alabama because Bear Bryant's up in his tower, and Mississippi, and all of these great schools and white players. And I remember calling back to Baltimore and saying to Don Shula, I said, I've got all these schools I'm going to: Georgia, Georgia Tech, Alabama, Mississippi, Vanderbilt. There are no players there that compares to Grambling, Texas A&M, or Texas Alcorn A&M, Texas Southern, Southern University, Fisk. I said, the best players out here are all African American. In those days, you said black players, but I said, who are we kidding? And because even in those days in the draft, you could have a Jerry Rice, who most people are familiar with today, or Stanley Morgan, or any of the players that have played with the Patriots, and you'd say, they belong in the first round. In those days, they go, well, he goes to Grambling, 5th, 6th, 7th round. Most of them are in the Hall of Fame, those players. But what I saw were these isolated communities, most of them far out of town, to drive out to Grambling, to drive through the Natchez Trace to Alcorn A&M, to go to Baton Rouge, a little bit different, to Southern University. It really, you understood that there were two worlds. And as great as those players were there, you went too far off that campus and you might not come back home. And what I saw pulling into the little towns, because I looked so young, and the police would stop me everywhere. And I remember this was the time when northern young people were getting on buses and going down to register voters. That, to me, was a death sentence, as we saw what happened in Mississippi. But I can remember every night, 23, 24, 25 years old, saying, when I would go back to the hotel, I'd say, or stopped in these towns by these police, and they'd look at my license, and I'd say, officer, I'm with the Colts. Because I had this big white car. That was a dead giveaway. It was a big Lincoln, but I had to be in it to take this trip across the country. And I'd say, hey, listen, boy, we're not buying that crap. You're down here to register them N-word. I said, I'm really not. I'm really a scout. And sometimes I had to get them to take me to a school to have them identify that I am Upton Bell of the Baltimore Colts. But I can't tell you how many times that I went back to the hotel and said, next day I'm going to find myself face down the Chattahoochee River. It was scary, maybe not quite as scary as now, but I grew to have such a great appreciation of there were two different worlds. And I still believe that there's two different worlds. It's gotten better, but when you see it like that, and I can remember the reverse fears. It was 1968, and it was Lou Brocknight who had gone to Southern University. Southern University is in Baton Rouge. LSU, who was the big dog, is right across the way. It was Lou Brocknight. Alcorn was playing. They were playing not Grambling because there was a doubleheader. They were playing Southern U. And so I had gone to a doubleheader in Mississippi, and of course could have gotten fired because I couldn't get any planes into Baton Rouge after that game. So I actually went out and hired a private pilot to fly me over the treetops from Jackson, Mississippi to Baton Rouge. It was not only scary, but I'm saying, you know, this is going to be $1,000. I could be fired for doing this. But anyway, we had him, we rented a car, and then we went to Southern University. I was the only white person in the audience. And it was the first time, and people were looking at me. There was a lot of anger at that time.
Yeah, sure.
You know, and again, I said I'm a scout with the Colts. We're supposed to be in the press box. There was no press box. You got on top of a car and looked down on the game. There was a fist fight before the game. There was all sorts of, and I'm saying to him, I think we better get out of here. And I think it was the first time it hit home with me that what would happen if I were an African American and an all-white crowd at that time? Would I gotten out of here alive? I don't know. That changed my life as far as how I learned to really look at being the one person in a completely different society. So that again, all those lessons I learned, I not only learned football, but I learned about the politics of race, the politics of life. What can happen to you? What happens if you end up on a back road somewhere? That chapter tells the story.
That's some very moving chapter,
two quick
yes.
things in there. And again, I look at life as being a lot of luck and who you know. 2 incidents. I was on my way to Selma. Now remember that in those days, and again, for people today that just, you know, get on their cell phones, do their Twitter, do their texting, watch what's on television. The radio, and even in those days, is your guide. And so I always had the radio on for 2 reasons. One, if you're driving late at night, because you go to a practice in the afternoon, you write your reports, and then you're on to the next city. I always had a fear, and a couple of people did die, of putting the radio on for fear of falling asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, sure.
And remember, you know, you're not out here on the Southeast Expressway.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
you're in Lorman.
country roads,
you're
no
in Lorman,
lights.
Mississippi.
Yeah.
And there are no lights, and they're never going to find you if you go off the road. But the other thing is I heard these reports on Selma, Alabama. And actually I was heading that way because I was going through and heading on to Birmingham. And so I pulled into a gas station, and I tell the story in my book. That I pull into a gas station, and when you're young and naive, I shouldn't have been, and you see the restrooms, whites,
Yeah.
and there was another word for African Americans. Naively, this guy comes out to pump the gas. I said, Jesus, that's terrible. And the guy looked at me, and he said, I quote it in the book, and he said, if you don't get your ass out of here, I've got a gun in there, and I'll blow your brains out. I didn't even wait. I took off.
Oh, yeah.
The other part of that trip was I was going into Memphis for spring practice, where you spend 3 or 4 days with the team to get a look at them. It's like the Patriots, you know, practices now, the OTAs. And so I was in Memphis. There were 3 or 4 plays I want to see. So I was going to stay 2 or 3 days. End of the first day, I said to the coach, you know, Coach, I want to come back. You have 2 or 3 more prospects I want to take a look at. And he looked at me, and it's the only time in my life that I can remember where somebody said something to me, I really paid attention. He said, go home. And I thought, what the hell did I do here? And the coach said, Martin Luther King is coming in here today for the garbage man strike on Friday. He said, I think there'll be violence here. He said, go home. So I went back to the hotel. I checked out. Holiday Inn, Memphis, got on a plane. When I get off the plane, I was looking up at the TV. Martin Luther King assassinated.
Good thing you took his advice.
Yeah.
Good thing.
But that's the world I lived in.
Yeah.
That's the world. Yeah. And that's why I say, again today, I'm not trying to preach. I'm just saying we've got to find a way to do a better job of understanding what it's like to be a minority in this country. So, end of that.
Yeah. Well, you and Ron Borges have written a book that's a history as well as a book about football. It's a book about our culture. It's a book about the country. So,
and you know what? I do want to say that Borges has done a great job with this. And the reason I didn't start out to pick the most popular person in town here. I wanted to pick somebody who understood the history, because Ron's just about 70, but he understood all of this. If I tried to get somebody today to do it, they might be better right or whatever else it is, but you have to understand the history. You have to understand the time. If you don't understand the history, how are you ever going to tell it? And that's what I looked at.
Yeah, the context is important, sure.
And there is the history, and there are besides the football part of it, people it really is a story of the way it was.
Now, how about a little about your media career? Who are some of your favorite interview subjects when you were in radio and TV?
Well, actually, it's interesting, and it hasn't been announced yet, and it will sometime in the future. I'm going to have two major collections, one on sports and one on over 500 people that I've interviewed over my 40-year career. And one of the things I learned from way back as a child growing up that you've gotten into, John, is that you can't be afraid of life. You cannot be afraid of taking chances. 3 times out of 4, you're going to fail. And I have. I have no problem with saying that I have failed. But the joy of taking the chance, failing or not, I would like to tell every young person out there, don't sit on your fanny in your parents' basement playing with your computer. Get out and look at life. At a certain period after being successful in sports, calling all sports with Bob Lobel's Sports Beat, with Channel 38 with Dan Shaughnessy and Lobel and Clark Booth and Joe Fitzgerald and many, Bob Ryan, one of the great writers of our time, is that I remember calling Lobel one day and saying, in 1990, I'm leaving sports. And he said to me, "You gotta be crazy." He said, "This is where you make the money." I said, "But I'm going on to another life. I never expect to make the money again. But I'm not doing it for that. I have never done anything for money." People might find that hard to believe, but I don't. So I decided I wanted to do straight talk radio. Part of my reason was I'm sick and tired of calling athletes' agents and saying it's going to cost you this money to have this athlete on. And I said, I'm, as much as I admire what athletes do, I said, why blow them up? Why not talk to either a lying politician or a statesman or somebody you don't have to pay, and they get on and tell you their story. So I left in 1990 and went into a different life, and it really changed my life. From 1990 to today, I've interviewed over 500 great authors, personalities, 40 of them Pulitzer Prize winners, 10 of them Nobel Prize winners. You name it, and I've interviewed them. And my show actually out at WTAG in Worcester, 2 out of the 3 years was named the best show in New England. Not sports, the best show. Right. And the thing that I got out of it is a great piece of advice that people told me. When you're interviewing somebody, I interviewed Herbert Walker Bush at the White House, Bill Clinton, Henry Kissinger, you name it, every Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton. I can go on and on. But this person said to me, if you want to do a great interview, know your material, ask the question, and get out of the way.
Good advice.
Don't make yourself the focal point of the interview. But I will tell you a really interesting story of a person that's the only one that couldn't sign my book, Stephen Hawking. I thought I'd never be able to get an interview with him, but I was able to do it. And even though the answers come out through a computer, it was one of the most fascinating interviews I've ever done.
Oh, I bet. Sure.
And so they liked it so much. I did it when he was in London. When he came here to Boston, in I want to say 93 or 94, and he was at the Wilbur Theater for a night on his book. They took me in and introduced me to him. I saw he didn't have the picture of it. And here's the funny thing about it. I walked out. In person, was a very little man in a chair. And when I walked out, I said, he is one of the great geniuses next to Einstein, but I still wouldn't want to be him.
No, of course not. Yeah,
I still wouldn't want to be him.
Sad story.
It is a sad story, but Muhammad Ali, without a doubt, was the brightest person who never went to college, could manipulate anybody, was funny. He gave me his private number, and I used to call him every week at his training camp. And we'd do an hour with him, just, hello, champ, how's it going? I mean, brilliant person, absolutely brilliant. Many of the people that I interviewed, Peter Bogdanovich, the movie director, he wrote in a book for me that will be in a collection. We did this whole interview on what it was like to interview Orson Welles. Now, again, the audience today, hopefully around the country, will look up who Orson Welles was, who was one of the most brilliant actors. A
lot of people remember
Citizen
Orson
Kane
Welles.
still
Sure.
considered.
Still.
His talk about what it was like to deal with this crazy man is classic radio, and that's what you want. Bill Clinton interviewed him when he was in all the trouble in New Hampshire the first time around. And I remember at the end of the interview, I walked into my producer and I said, I don't care who he had sex with, what he did, he's going to be president. So they're just some of the many that I really interviewed.
Well, in our book, Dead in Good Company, in which you have an essay, something you wrote at the very end is something that will always stay with me, and it's kind of the way you've lived your life. And you said, when I get to the gate, if it's closed, I will climb over it.
Yeah.
And that's the way you've lived your life, and it's all in there. It's a great read, and you've had a storied, wonderful career, and people should know that.
You really would. I'm not going to get rich with this book. That isn't the reason that I wrote it, but I would like enough people. It's done so well that they've kept it out there even for 2 years. There are so many other things. I know we don't have all the time, but I will tell a couple of stories about my mother. She was, again, I live with two parents who are like, your head's on a swivel. What, you go to the dinner table, they talk about the Kennedys going to the dinner table and all the things they learn. Well, I could hear politics, I could hear showbiz, I could hear everything. But you're like this. What did he say? She was, and the movie was just out yesterday again, Love Me or Leave Me, James Cagney and Ruth Etting. And she and Ruth Etting were friends. And they were roommates when they were on the road, and particularly in Chicago. And Ruth Etting says to her one night, Mo the Gimp Snyder, who she married for a while, who's played by Jimmy Cagney in the movie, she said, we've been invited by Machine Gun Ned McGurn and Mo to have dinner with Al Capone. My mother, naive, heard of his name, but she said she didn't know really who Capone was. So they go to this restaurant, and she walks in, and she ends up sitting across from Capone, and she noticed all of the, I'm sure, all the gangsters with their backs against the wall, and all of the show business people, and then their backs are to the door. And she says, while he's smoking a cigar, oh, Mr. Capone, why aren't we sitting next to each other? And he just, and Eddie, kicks her and says, because we're live baked. I mean, that's
wow.
That's so many of the things that happen. But again, it's you can't, because of today where everybody's on everybody's talk show and they sit on the couch and they say most of them are very boring stories, but they're promoting their product. I understand. Yeah. Those were real people. They weren't doing shows to pitch their stuff. They lived among each other. Final story on that. When the Lindbergh baby was stolen, a group came to my father and said Al Capone was in prison in Philadelphia at the time, federal prison, not far. I actually walked down and saw it, and said, Bert, can you get in to see Capone and see if it was an underworld job? He went in to see Capone. This is how quickly. Forget Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Within 24 hours, Capone got the word back to him. Not an underworld job. Look somewhere else.
Wow. Yeah. That was
So
the kind
there
of
it
power
is.
they had. Well, finally, Upton, what advice do you have for young people in whatever pursuit they choose? But what advice in general would you give young people today in this very different world?
Well, since I'm a very young person that have tried to maintain a youthful outlook on life, first thing I would tell them is you really turn the cell phones off for a while and really learn how to read.
Oh,
Number one. Yeah. Number two, learn how to write. If you can write, you can get a job anywhere. But also you've got to be interested in learning about the past. I can't tell you how many people I run into, and I'm not talking down to anybody, is that the more you read, I don't care what it is you read, reading will enable you to not only bring greater enjoyment to your life, but give you the ability to converse when you go in for an interview, whatever you do. Also, learn to write. I don't care whether you're a good writer or a bad writer. Reading and writing, communicating, but not through a text, not through the social media. I mean, I see these players get on there. You know what the worst thing that's happened to sports? Twitter.
Yes.
Twitter.
Not just sports,
Yeah.
but
And that's why, by the way, I have such great admiration for the present Boston Bruins and what they're doing. I mean, great comeback in the playoffs. They're one of the last sports left. They don't get on, they don't do Twitter. They're very much within themselves. Their team is very, very important to them. They pay a very high price for the pain that they accept. As you know, Zdeno Chara, broken jaw.
Yeah.
Who the hell plays with a broken jaw? You wouldn't play it in football. So there is the whole idea that you need time. And you know, I walk in the forest, I mountain climb, I do all these things. Please, it used to be a day when somebody wasn't on saying, you know what, I'll be down the mountain very, very shortly. Order me the small pizza. Yeah. Please. But read, write, take time to turn off the phone. I have a phone, I have all that stuff. Take that time for yourself. But also, nobody's going to ask you, I always tell people this, nobody's going to ask you on your deathbed how much money you made, how many tweets you put out there. You know what you're going to ask yourself? Did I do what I wanted to do in life? And I guarantee you a lot of people won't do what they should have done in life. I had no regrets.
Yeah, now more than ever. Thank you, Upton. This has been terrific.
Great.
Thank you for
all right, John.
Enlightening us.
That's right. Yes, the gate's closing. But I won't worry about that because I'll climb it.
Right. And that's the way you've lived your life. And that's tremendous.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah.
Climb that gate. Put yourself out there. What do you got to lose? Just another bad joke.